Per day.
The Joe Rogan.
The Zionist thing is define the difference between Jewish and Zionist.
Okay.
Oh, there's so much inaccuracy in that. I was surprised. If that's an example, it shows he really knows nothing about this issue and let a propagandist go on and on and on.
This is the Dean Show.
Assalamu alaikum, greetings of peace. Welcome to the Dean Show. I'm Eddie, your host, and we got a very important topic that we're covering with our special guest. Allison Weir is a freelance journalist, a activist, and someone who has dedicated her life to this topic. Many would consider her and argue that she's a scholar and academic in this area with a profound amount of knowledge, and that's why we're bringing her on to help educate us on the issue of Palestine and Israel. Let's bring on our special guest, Allison.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. We're honored to have you, Allison. How are you doing?
I had my coffee. It's early here in San Francisco, and I'm very happy to be on your program.
We're very happy to have you. And did I miss anything out?
I think you covered it. I've been working on this for about 20 years now.
20 years. And your organization's name is If Americans Only Knew. Yes, well,
the official name is If Americans Knew.
If Americans Knew. Let's start with that. I mean, that's a catchy title. Like, if Americans knew what?
Well, there's so much, but the main thing is if Americans knew that we are involved in Israel-Palestine, that we are a central player in this issue. Most of us think, it has something to do with our Jewish friends or our Muslim friends, or so most Americans don't know that we're very involved in what they think is a distant, confusing issue. So if Americans knew that we are very involved, that we give Israel much, much over $10 million per day.
The Joe Rogan.
And if Americans knew what Israel is doing with our money, the injustice, the violence, the oppression, the cruelty, then I think we would demand that U.S. policies change. So that's, I guess, a synopsis.
Go ahead and subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell. Help us get our numbers back up. Did you know that many years ago, the Dean Show, when we started 2006, we used to broadcast for many years on the Khalifa clothing channel, currently known as Digital Minbar. So we're trying to get our numbers back up because the channel at that time got closed. Then we started the official Dean Show channel. We're trying to get our numbers back up to where they should be. And that's this number here, 855, combined what we currently have, 442. We should be over 1,200,000 subscribers. Help us to get our numbers back to where they should be. With that small setback that we had many years ago, you guys can help us by subscribing right now and hitting that notification bell. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of this show. Assalamu alaikum. And don't forget to support us on our Patreon page. I want to get your reaction. We're going to go to mainstream. Mainstream meaning, what's typically put out there where people usually get and form their ideas. And then we're going to come back to actually where you were at one point in your life, the kind of understanding that you had. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the Joe Rogan show.
I've heard of that. Yes, I know it's very famous. I don't know much about it, though.
It's a very famous program. So we're going to go ahead and get your reaction to this topic that they're discussing. So if you want me to stop at any point, let me know, but we'll continue on for at least a few minutes.
Okay.
All right.
Experience.
The Zionist thing is define the difference between Jewish and Zionist.
Okay. Zionist is the idea of that the Jews have a right to national self-determination. The Jewish, should I keep going?
Yeah, please.
You looked at me like I should stop.
No.
The Jewish longing to return to the land of Israel is something that's like inescapable if you read the Bible, right? Like it's all over there. The whole idea of, and you can discount it, discount God, whatever. The fact is that the Jews are a people that were birthed sort of in this land, which we now call the land of Israel. And they were expelled by the Romans around 2,000 years ago. And then they came back to that land, right? It's like they defied the logic of history in doing that. Because by all rights, they were an indigenous group to that land. They were kicked out and expelled. And then they went back 2,000 years later. Like, it's a crazy, extraordinary story. So leave that to one part. Zionism, the way that I think is the simplest definition, is the belief in the Jewish right to self-determination, and it's the Jewish liberation movement. And so let's go back to like pre-1948, which is the year that the State of Israel is established. And you have Jews in, Poland and all of these other places debating, like, what is the way that we can solve our constant, like, the systemic oppression that we are constantly enduring. And there were all of these different responses to that problem. One argument was the socialist argument, the anti-capitalist argument. If the problem is capitalism, and if only we defeat capitalism, anti-Semitism will go away. Some argued that total assimilation was the right way to solve it. We just need to kind of disappear as Jews. That's the only way we'll be fully accepted. And another group, which was not even the most popular group, is this idea of we need to be able to determine our own fate. And we will never be fully accepted. The only way that we can determine our own fate is this idea of us having our own state and our own army where we can protect ourselves. And that is ultimately the idea that sort of wins out. So when you're having a debate about, when people say today they're an anti-Zionist, the reason that is so problematic is they're not making that argument in 1920s Eastern Europe, when the state doesn't exist. It's one thing to be an anti-Zionist in theory, right? It's the same. The analogy I like to make is if we're a couple and we want to have a baby and we're debating, should we have the baby? Can we afford the baby? Where are we going to send the baby to school? All this stuff. That's a totally moral argument to make. You can't make that argument of should we have the baby after the baby is born. The baby is born. It exists. Israel exists. It's a place. It's not an idea. It's not an abstraction. It is a place that contains the largest Jewish community on planet Earth. And so when people say that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, it's like, what are you talking about? It exists. So what do you want? So I asked the person that makes the anti-Zionist argument, what do you imagine will happen? Like, do you think that you're advocating for a genocide right away? Or like, you have to have no sense of Middle Eastern history or politics to make the argument that you can be a minority in that region without protection. We know what that looks like. That looks like the story of the Yazidis. It looks like the story of the Kurds, the story of the Zoroastrians, the story, frankly, of Christians who are going to be completely expelled from the Middle East within the next decade, which is a story no one talks about.
So the anti-Zionist sentiment, when people start talking about Zionists, what they're essentially talking about is Israel just existing.
Yes.
Like they're anti-Israel existing.
Correct.
All right, Alison, what are your thoughts?
Oh, there's so much inaccuracy in that. I was surprised. My impression had been very positive about Joe Rogan, just the things I've heard about him. But if that's an example, it shows he really knows nothing about this issue and let a propagandist go on and on and on with misstatements without questioning them or bringing up any real facts about it. So I ended up just having to take notes because almost every sentence she said was incorrect. If you'll give me a few minutes, I'll try to go through this. And keep in mind, I'm not Arab or Muslim or Palestinian. I have no family connections to any of those cultures. I'm not Jewish. So when I began to look into this issue 20 years ago, I was very sympathetic to Israel. That's the way most Americans are brought up. We're acutely aware of the Nazis and what they did, and very sympathetic to Israel because of because of the Nazis, and because of the news coverage that we've gotten for decades. That's sort of like what we just saw now on Joe Rogan. So when I began to look into this, I was coming from a pro-Israel perspective, but just wanting the full, honest picture. So the information I'll give you now is what I found, not because I expected to find it or wanted to find it, but this is what you discover when you actually look at the real facts. Her definition of Zionism is quite a misrepresentation. Um, the fact that Jews have the, quote, right to self-determination misses the point. What Zionism has said is that Jews have the, quote, right to self-determination on someone else's land, that they have the right to expel an entire population so that they can take it over for a Jewish state. That's what Zionism was and what it remains today. So one could even question, I'm not sure if Presbyterians have a right to their own state, or Zoroastrians have a right to their own state, or I'm not sure anyone has a right to their own state just because we exist. We have a right to exist. I think we have a right to try to bring up our children in safety and to prosper. But Zionism was the claim that it was that Jews had the right and the need to take over someone else's land. What she leaves out is that when this movement began in the late 1800s, it didn't begin in 1948. It was a political movement that began in the late 1800s. Most Jews around the world, Jewish Americans, Jews in Europe, Jews in the region itself of Palestine, did not embrace it. Most did not become Zionists. Quite a few actively opposed it. Now she talks about the Bible supposedly endorsing political Zionism. No, it didn't. In fact, the people who have been some of the most vehement against Zionism from the very beginning were observant religious Jews who considered this a heresy. Yes, Jews were expelled. They believe this was done really by God. The Romans did it, but they feel that it was God's will because they had broken commandments of various types. They had broken the covenant and therefore were expelled. This was the theology that was prevalent at the time that Zionism began and is still held by many observant Jews. So this was considered, they were not supposed to go back at the point of a gun. This was heresy. This was not what the Bible decreed or said. So she's inaccurate about that. She's saying that they came back. They came back. Well, I have ancestors, not much more recent than 2,000 years ago, who left parts of Europe, who left Scotland, Wales, Germany, Poland. I don't feel I have the right to go back and take over those lands. And yet they're talking about people some of whose ancestors left 2,000 years ago. And by the way, many left voluntarily. Yes, there was an expulsion, but there were people that left after that. There were people that came back after that. So this is a misrepresentation of history. I think it's also good to point out that not every Jewish American or Jew around the world has ancestry there. So even that is inaccurate. She's calling it an indigenous group. Well, at the time that political Zionism began, the Jewish population of Palestine was a little under 5%. 80% of the indigenous population were Muslim. 15% of the indigenous population were Christian. So this was a movement that planned to get rid of, one way or another, 95% of the indigenous population, to intentionally get rid of 95% of the indigenous population so that they could take it over for an exclusively ethno-religious state. That's what Zionism was. She's saying it's the belief of Jews around the world. No, it wasn't. Most Jews in the United States said, we're Americans. We like it here. This is a good place for us. We're not interested in going to some place in the Middle East that we really feel a religious connection, just as Christians feel a religious connection to Bethlehem. But we don't feel that we have the right or even the desire to go and take over Bethlehem. So that was incorrect. She implies that this started in 1948 when Israel did unilaterally declare that they were creating a Jewish state in Palestine. The way they did it, by the way, was by warfare, a war of ethnic cleansing. As a very good Jewish Israeli historian has a book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. He documents very thoroughly that this was a war of ethnic cleansing, that they expelled through force at least 750,000 people. Some have said it was 1 million, but it was probably at least 750,000 people were expelled through this war of ethnic cleansing. And additional people were expelled in 1967 and since that time. So when Zionists say they had the right to create a Jewish state, what they are saying is that they had the right to forcibly expel men, women, and children from their homes, from their ancestral land. If anybody says Israel has the right to exist, what they are saying, but most people don't know this, Zionists know it, but other people that say that don't know, they are